Welcome to a Sodus Bay Historical Society History Alive online program. The Sodus Bay Historical Society is pleased to present Sodus Bay the Beautiful, a sailing voyage around our great Sodus Bay, written in 1902 by Lewis Morris Philo. Your reader for this adventure is the town of Huron historian Rosa Fox. This History Alive presentation of Sodus Bay the Beautiful is enhanced by postcards, photos, and maps from the late 19th and early 20th century. Please sit back and enjoy this travelogue of Lewis Morris Philo's Sodus Bay the Beautiful. Before we begin, a little about the author, Lewis Morris Philo. L.M. Philo, as he was known locally, was a prominent Elton, New York merchant, politician, inventor, and community leader. Lewis was married to Martha Johnson Philo from Sodus, New York. Philo sold dry goods and groceries during the late 1800s in Elton. In 1896, Philo expanded his business, opening a store on Sand Point, Sodus Bay. The Philo merchandising stores had a 38-year history from 1882 to 1920. Philo started his political explorations as a member of the Democratic Party in 1880. He served as overseer of the poor and was elected as a delegate to the Wayne County Democratic Caucus in 1884. By 1894, Philo transferred his allegiance to the Republican Party. He gave the opening speech at the Wayne County Republican Caucus that year, and during that address is reported to have given reasons why he switched parties. At that same meeting, Philo was also unanimously elected to serve as chairman of the Wayne County Republican Caucus. In addition to being a merchant and politician, Philo was also an inventor. A horseshoer, Philo invented, marketed, and received a patent in 1890 for a horse boot. The boot was intended to prevent and heal a horse's foot problems by keeping the foot in a moist and pliable condition. Philo was also a skilled writer. This delightful travelogue of a sailboat trip around Great Sodus Bay provides a scenic and historic description of the bay as seen through the eyes of someone in the early 1900s. Welcome to Lewis Morris Philo's Sodus Bay the Beautiful. Preface. Frequently, a wish has been expressed that in some way the beauties of Sodus Bay, including its islands, shores, scenery, and general points of interest, be described, and to that end we shall endeavor to do so, not forgetting, however, our inability to do justice in our description of this grand and beautiful inland lake. We hope that those who read our effort will enjoy it to the same extent that we have in describing its beauties. In giving the description, we will assume to have made a tour of its shores and islands in the order of an exploration. And as the writer has personally visited every point spoken of in the following pages, and can vouch for the truthfulness and accuracy of the description, he feels that he is justified in so doing. L. Morris Philo. Sodus Bay the Beautiful. Sodus Bay is a halfway port between the cities of Rochester and Oswego, and is bounded by the towns of Sodus and Huron. It is about 5 miles in length and from 1/4 to 3 miles in width. It is considered to be the best natural harbor on the southern shore of Lake Ontario. For beauty and grandeur, it has no equal in this part of the state. The writer, having lived near its shore since childhood, has often heard its beauties compared by travelers through foreign countries to the scenery of Switzerland and Italy. We are informed that it takes its name from the Indian word Sandusky, meaning silvery waters. Early writers tell us of the many trails leading from their distant settlements to the shores of this beautiful bay, thus showing their admiration also, even in those early days, for this handsome sheet of water. Lying well above, on a point of land dividing bay and lake, is the historic village of Sodus Point, with its churches, schoolhouse, village hall, and business places, and many beautiful homes, fine lawns, and pleasant drives. Also, its railroad and trolley line connecting the village with the distant cities and towns. Standing here and looking about us, we see at this point something of the beauties of Sodus Bay, with its islands, bluffs, capes, bars, and handsome shores of wood and fern, and the grand expanse of water spread out before us as far as the eye can reach. But, as we are to write of other points on the bay also, we are forced to leave this enchanted spot. And now, descending to the dock of the steamer Sunbeam near the Northern Central Railroad station, we are soon on board our light and safe skiff, supplied with a nice sheet, and before a fresh breeze, spinning along with my friend at the tiller, while I attend the sail. We first rounded the wharf known as the Arundel Dock, this being built of large piles and running well out into the water. This steamer draws from 8 to 10 feet of water, and the bottom of the bay being very weedy here accounts for its extra length. The dock is also used for the unloading of iron ore, lumber, and feldspar, the latter being brought here in large sailing vessels from Kingston, Ontario, and shipped over the Northern Central Railroad to Pittsburgh and other points for the purpose of making doorknobs, mantles, etc. We were now passing along the shore leading southwest, which, being quite weedy and very shallow, necessitated our keeping well out. Just passing the old elevator and dock of the Northern Central Railroad, we were now before their large coal trestle, on top of which was standing a locomotive with several coal cars, which were about to return to the main line after unloading at the pockets as announced by the ringing of the bell. Lying here were several schooners and barges of Canadian and other ports, awaiting their cargo of coal, thus showing this to be one of the best coaling points on the lake. Inland, but a short distance, can be seen the main station of the Northern Central Railroad, a post office, stores, and markets. This section of the village being known as Macyville at one time, but now as a part or suburb of Sodus Point. Here also can be seen the Mammoth Malt House and elevators of the Parsons Malting Company, once doing a large business, but now idle and going to decay. We were now approaching Margaretta Grove, just to our right. The water here is quite shallow, but the grove makes up well for that, it being one of the finest on the bay, well sodded and covered with old forest growth chestnut. It is quite noted as a picnic ground and is also used by the Empire Organization of Veterans and Sons of Veterans for their week's outing each summer. After passing Margaretta, we came to the mouth of First Creek, which rises near the village of Alton, about 4 miles away, from Two Springs on the farm of A. D. Clark. Crossing the outlet, we soon came to the famous and unique summer place known as Santiago, owned and managed by the genial Captain Ben Hopkins, who, upon seeing our boat headed for the dock, at once shouted, "Come ashore!" which we did. We advise all visitors at Sodus Bay to be sure to call here, as it is one of the most interesting places on its shores. The visitor will recognize it at once, as it is located in the only thick grove of willows at this point. The first thought upon landing here was, what could possibly have suggested this peculiar style of building and surroundings to the mind of Captain Hopkins? Truly, no one could describe this place. We will try to give you something of an idea, however, by calling your attention to the names of the buildings as we remember them, such as Hockomock Tent, Squabola, Glenora, Lamoka, Idaho, Winona, Mendota, and the Bungalow, which is one of the strangest ones, its furnishings reminding the writer of the Turkish rooms shown at the World's Fair. Another, the Two Orphans, consists of two nice sleeping rooms, fully as strange in appearance, and elevated about 10 feet above the level of the ground, and reached by an outside stairway. We will not attempt further description, but will call your attention to the living rooms of the family, which are very comfortable and tidy, all being ceiled and nicely decorated, the sitting room having an open fireplace for the chilly evenings of spring and fall. Leading from the main building, there are walks to the sleeping apartments spoken of, which are intended for the guests. Each apartment, built separate, with interiors nicely finished in natural wood, and furnished with clean bedding and towels, presents a very inviting appearance to the guest about to retire. The washstand near the shore represents a mammoth Japanese umbrella. Where paint is seen on any of the buildings, you will notice that it has been applied in the most strange and weird shapes and colors imaginable. Now, as we have spent so much of our time at this place, we find that we must part with the genial captain, which we do so with great reluctance. Continuing on our way, we soon passed Locust Grove, with its row of cottages situated on the high bank above us to the right. Soon we passed a very pretty and commodious cottage, and before it, but a short distance away, lying at anchor, was a handsome racing yacht, Thalma, which now holds the Cup of 1901, both the property of the Sill family, whose large farm borders on the bay at this point. By this time we were at the mouth of what is known as Second or Mill Creek, which takes its rise about 8 miles away between the villages of Lyons and South Sodus. We were soon forced to lower our sails while ascending the stream, and make use of the oars. Working our way against the current, we soon came to the old mill, now idle from lack of power. Here we found a very high dam of solid masonry, at the base of which we noticed in motion the hydraulic ram which furnishes the water supply to the home of Mr. Chamberlain on what is known as the Shaker Tract, this being a part of the 1,400-acre farm formerly owned and managed by the Shakers. You will notice here the same solid and substantial buildings erected by them, yet standing and in good repair, kept so by the management of Mr. Chamberlain, he being proud, and justly so, of this beautiful and extensive tract of land. Inland, but a short distance from the water, are the marks showing where once stood the large custom flouring mill of the Shakers, well remembered by this writer. Here we partook of lunch before starting on our return downstream, which we found so pleasant, drifting with the current, that we had reached the waters of the bay before we were aware of it, when lifting our sails, we soon rounded Point Lookout. The cottage on this fine elevation is owned by Mr. Warren of New York City, and is occupied by himself and a number of students during the summer. Mr. Warren is the principal of the Warren Business School of New York City, and comes to this point for his annual outing. He is the owner of the racing yacht Wissy Hickson, and with Captain Clark of this port in command, seems to be having a very enjoyable time. We were now heading for the south, and were soon before the delightful shores known as Briscoe's Cove. It seemed to us too pretty a place to pass by unnoticed, so we headed our boat for the beach, and were soon on the shores of this famous place, made so by its great natural beauties, and also from the fact of it being the ground on which John Briscoe, the great surveyor, died and was buried while engaged in running a line for the government, due north by the North Star. While standing here, our imagination almost leads us to see that party of engineers and assistants, without the light of the sun, working their way northward through the dense forests, then infested by wild animals, and we thought, truly, we know but little of the hardships of the earlier days. This cove is surrounded by the original forest, which has been underbrushed to a certain extent and presents a very pretty, though somewhat wild appearance. The shore being of clear white sand and gravel makes it very pleasing to the visitor, while the water is as clear as at any point on the bay. Its gently sloping beach makes it an ideal bathing place. Leaving this delightful spot and continuing on our way, we soon passed Cherry Point, and were rounding the boathouse and cottage on the dock, owned and occupied by Mr. Chamberlain, this being the home of the little steamer Sigma. We now passed the steam mill owned by Mr. Chamberlain and managed by Mr. Boorman. It does an immense business in coarse sawing. Leaving this on our right, we soon crossed the mouth of Third Creek, which rises about 5 miles away. Then we rounded the headland, known as Hunter's Point, which the visitor will recognize by the large windmill on the shore. We were soon headed south again, passing the summer place known as Burns Cove, lying on the west shore. It is comparatively new, and commands a fine view down the bay. Standing on the bank here, one can see the islands, the shores of the mainland, Sodus Point, and Lake Ontario in the distance. While passing this place, our thoughts lead us to look again to the shore, almost expecting to see the wily Indian crouching there, as we have been thinking of the old dugout recently brought to the surface at this point, after lying buried in the sands for so many years. We then passed the cove and shore of what is known as Grassy Point. Early settlers tell us of the brickyard once located there, but now tilled as a part of the Edwards farm. Rounding this point, defined by the reeds running well out into the bay, and looking to the right, we notice that the mainland is covered by a fine grove of chestnut trees, and is a very pretty place, although not much elevated above the water. We then had a clear view up the bay, and saw in the distance the long bridge that joins the two shores. As we neared it, our minds went back to years long gone by when, as boys, we saw the large schooners built and launched near its west approach. We were led to exclaim, "How the march of improvement has changed the condition of life!" Soon we were headed for the east, and were passing over the route of the old ferry, which we well remembered as the only means of crossing the bay at one time. Making a turn to the north, we were riding over the natural bed of beautiful and famous lilies, a species of lotus noted for its size and beauty. This handsome flower is said to bloom in but one other part of the United States, and in its beauty defies description, and is the delight of all who visit here during its season. It reaches perfection during the month of August, and presents the most beautiful sight to be seen on the bay, covering the entire eastern half of the water from the old bridge to the home of Mr. Stacy near the dock. No pen can describe the beauty of this flower. It must be seen in its own home on the water to be appreciated. We were now before the village of Resort, formerly known as Port Glasgow. Older people tell us that it obtained its name from a former resident of Glasgow, Scotland, who located here. It now contains 2 hotels, 2 stores, a post office, and quite a number of residences. Here we found a long dock running well out into the bay for the accommodation of the steamers. It is owned by Mr. Stacy of Resort, who keeps a boat livery in connection with his store. We were now on our return trip by way of the East Shore, and were soon passing before the burial place of the once prominent and respected Loomis family. It is located near the shore between Bonnycastle and Resort on a slight elevation and shaded by the original forest chestnut trees. We were soon at the dock at Bonnycastle, and as we saw the sun descending beyond the western hills, we decided that no better place could be found for our night's rest. We then ascended by the stairs and wended our way up the hillside very tired, but with a feeling of satisfaction with our day's outing. On reaching the level above, we were greeted by Messrs. Catchpole and Cole in such a friendly and gentlemanly manner that we were at once made to feel perfectly at home. After our supper at their boarding house, we walked out over their broad and well-kept lawn, which descends through a grove of grand old chestnuts, which, with its semicircle of pretty cottages, presents a very handsome picture. Standing on this fine elevation, we had a clear view of the beautiful scenery of the bay and islands and western shore, with its cove and sloping hillsides. As we looked about us, it seemed to us that the management of this place had well in view the comfort of their guests. We noticed the large and commodious pavilion, the perfectly made croquet ground, the large swing, comfortable seats, and substantial boat livery. The beauties of Bonnycastle and these comforts make it one of the main points at which all steamers stop, thus calling many to this handsome place. On the following morning, we again started on our trip, and were soon passing the old dock and mill formerly owned and managed by William Loomis of New York. We were informed that on these grounds was once located a small village known as Sloop Landing, which was destroyed by the British in the War of 1812. As this was on the line of the original state road, the 2 shores were connected by a ferry at one time. Rounding this point, we were soon passing the ruins of another old mill, which, in connection with the large farm adjoining, was once the property of the Reverend Mr. Purdy, who at that time was the owner of what is now known as Lake Bluff. It will be remembered that Mr. Purdy first presented that place to the notice of the public by holding camp meetings there when it was nearly a wilderness, about 25 or 30 years ago. Sailing gently along, we were soon confronted by quite an extensive bridge, which we noticed connected Leroy's Island with the mainland on the east. Lowering our sails and spar, we were soon on the opposite side and running through the channel between the island and shore. Passing Wintergreen Point on the mainland, our attention was attracted to the pretty white cottage with its broad verandas near the shore, owned by James Barnes of Huron, and occupied as a summer home by his daughter, Mrs. James K. Gatchell, with her husband, of Brooklyn. We were now at Lake Bluff. Leaving our boat at the dock, we ascended the hill and rested on its summit, the highest point overlooking Sodus Bay, and the old lake lying just before us. After partaking of an abundant and well-prepared dinner at the Lake Bluff house, we strolled out to the high bank, or bluff, which overlooks Lake Ontario by about 100 feet elevation. From this point, we had as fine a view of the grand old lake as could be desired. As we looked out upon the waters, the appearance of sky and water meeting in the distance was both grand and sublime. To our left, in the distance, we saw the government piers and lighthouses, and near by Point Charles, connecting by its bar to the mainland at the base of this summit. Looking backward toward the hotel, we saw the pretty cottages facing the wide lawns of the park, and we decided in our minds that this must be an ideal place for rest and comfort. We are told that hay fever patients coming here for the season soon find relief, owing to the elevation and dry atmosphere. We now retraced our steps and were soon at the dock. Boarding our boat, we headed for the west and were running along parallel to the sandbar, on which are quite a number of cottages. Soon we were at Point Charles, formerly known as Farr's Island. At that time it is said to have contained about 30 acres of land and was used as a farm. It is now reduced to about 6 acres, but being well guarded by breakwaters, it will naturally increase in size by the action of the sand washed up by the waves. Walking about its grounds, we noticed its tidy and well-kept appearance. It is nicely covered by cottages, but not crowded. Point Charles being on an elevation, the cottages are above all boathouses, docks, etc., thus giving an unobstructed view of the bay and lake. Being connected with the government's East Pier, the cottagers enjoy the privilege of an elegant promenade of about 1/3 of a mile in length, with the bay on one side and the lake on the opposite. The people of these handsome grounds are from the adjacent towns nearby and seem to enjoy all the comforts of their fine summer home. They have the privilege of a system of waterworks furnished by a large windmill with tanks, etc. While we do not wish to compliment one more than another, we feel justified in calling the attention of the visitor to the substantial and handsome tower with its brown stone base and shingled superstructure towering well above the surrounding buildings and capped by its pretty shaped dome, being designed and erected under the personal supervision of Mrs. Seymour Scott, whose commodious cottage lies just to the east. Leaving these delightful shores, we headed south and east, and were soon on the north point of the pretty island formerly known as Islay, but now as Newark Island, deriving its present name from the village which furnished its first cottage settlers. The cottage nearest its northern point is owned and occupied each summer by Mr. and Mrs. Perkins of Newark. The view from this point is grand indeed. Running well out into the bay, it gives an unobstructed view of all points of the compass. Leaving out further description and passing the pleasant cottage homes of Mr. Bartle and Mr. Dwyer, we were now on the southern shore of this island before the large and unique cottage of Professor Westervelt of Rochester, principal and instructor of the deaf-mute institution in that city. It is known as the Bungalow. This is not the only summer home of Professor Westervelt, but it is used by him to add to the happiness and comfort of the many mutes of that institution, as we often see them at the Bungalow by the score. Standing here, we had a fine view of the bay, the western shore, Sand Point, and Eagle Island, lying just before us. A narrow stretch of water separates the two islands. Taking our boat, we were soon at the beach at Eagle Island, formerly known as Erin, and commonly designated as Big Island. We found this to be the largest of the group and said to contain about 100 acres. In fact, it would make a very fine farm. We are informed that this is the property of Mrs. E. B. Parsons, and was laid out by Mr. Parsons as an ideal summer place. As we ascended the walk to the buildings located just beyond, we noticed the natural beauties of the approach and the taste shown in the erection of the different buildings. We noticed the comfortable dwelling for the use of the keeper, and the large barn, rustic buildings, pavilions, etc. And as we passed more substantial buildings, they called to our mind the pleasant farm scene we had so often looked upon on the mainland. Again, taking our boat, we were soon on the island known as Leroy's Island, originally called Butte. This is of good size also, and possesses a racetrack, many pretty cottages, and the ruins of what was, but a short time ago, a large and commodious hotel, recently destroyed by fire. Even as late as the summer of 1901, many Indian relics were found on this island, showing that the early Indians also admired this place. This point commands an extensive and clear view of lake and bay, and overlooks other points of interest, owing to its high position. From it can be seen Sodus Point, Sand Point, Point Charles, and the other islands. We decided this to be a very handsome island, though comparatively new to campers. Leaving the island, we were soon crossing the channel near the government piers. Here we noticed the revolving light at the outer end of the west pier, and the beacon light at the elbow of the same. Crossing, we were soon before the cottage of the Northern Central Railroad on the beach. Now, rounding to, we were again headed up the bay, and running along the northern shore of Sand Point on our right. Here we noticed the many pavilions and hotels, the clubhouse on the opposite shore, and the great number of cottages. This point of land divides the waters of the bay by running out about 1/3 to 1/2 of a mile, and joins the mainland near the Lakeshore Railroad station at Sodus Point. It is a village in itself, and is made up of campers from the nearby towns and cities. Very few people come to the bay without visiting Sand Point. It is really alive during the season, as the attractions and amusements are centered here. The greater portion of its walks being of cement, it is justly entitled to be the promenade of the mainland. The steamboat dock and boat liveries located here are great drawing cards, as they not only call the pleasure seekers, but the fishermen as well. The racing course of the Yacht Club, lying close about Sand Point, attracts a great number of people also. Passing along this shore to the extreme outer end of Sand Point, we turned and followed the southern shore homeward bound. We soon passed the pleasant summer home of Reverend Father Kavanaugh, its location being one of the most interesting on Sand Point, with the cottage facing the avenue running from the main street to the water on the southern shore. Here we noticed the clean, sloping beach, with its long reach of clean, white sand and gravel, making an ideal bathing place. This same clean appearance of shore and beach extends all along the waterfront of Mr. Kavanaugh's grounds to the entrance of Jameson Cove, a small but very pretty sheet of water forming a very snug harbor for boats of light draft. We are disappointed in not being able to inform the reader how this little body of water obtained its name, but it is certainly considered of importance as it is always found on maps and charts of Sodus Bay and Sand Point. We, we noticed the many cottages which are favored by bordering on this pretty little bay, as well as facing the main street of Sand Point. The one nearest to Father Kavanaugh's place is the summer home of the Sturwalds of Newark, the next adjoining belonging to Mr. Garlock of the same village. Next is Dr. MacDonald's, also of Newark. Then comes Mrs. Kitchen's of Williamson, used as a boarding house, and then as the White Kitchen, which must be an ideal place as it is complimented by all who stop there. The next in line is the property of M. Engelson of Williamson, which is joined by the cottage home of the Tripp brothers of Sodus. Then comes the boarding house of Peacock and Thorpe, known as the Home Comfort Cottage. It seems really entitled to the name, as all who are entertained there testify to its fitness. Next comes Mr. Wilder of Williamson, who owns 3 cottages, all near this cove, which are furnished for the purpose of rental. The cottages of Messrs. Thorne and Harris of Newark are next in line, and immediately following is the one owned and occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Barton Peer of Williamson. A short distance to the west is the Crothers cottage, the last on this little body of water. Lying just back of the Pier Place, on the main street, is the cottage boarding house of Mrs. Harbordson, which, like the others mentioned, is also well spoken of, showing the ability of the boarding houses, in connection with the hotels and pavilions, to entertain all who visit them. We had now made the tour of Little Bay, and were soon on the wide waters of Sandusky. We were now passing the substantial and handsome clubhouse, the home of the Sodus Bay Yacht Club, with its pretty lawns and with wharf extending well out, and along the waterfront nearly surrounded by many handsome yachts lying at anchor. It presented a very pleasing picture. In a few minutes we had passed by the dock of the Bayshore House. And were again at the place from whence we started 2 days before on our tour of Sodus Bay, the beautiful